Hey everybody, it's Pastor Megan Rohrer, and I am here, and I am a transgender pastor in the Lutheran tradition, and I prefer not to have pronouns, but honestly, any pronouns that people use are fine with me, because heck, most of my day is not about my pronouns. But today I have with me a fantastic person.
Hi, I'm Austen Hartke. I am also a trans person. I identify as a trans guy. I identify as bisexual. And what do I do? I am the director of Transmission Ministry Collective, which is an organization that supports trans Christians. And then I'm also the author of a book on trans experiences in the Bible.
Would it be
There
this
it
book?
is, that book right there.
Yay! Yeah,
So that's me.
transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. It's a
There
great
it
book.
is.
You can see I have lots of dog ears in it. Sorry if that
Oh,
offends people, but
I'm a dog ear person too. Don't tell
yeah.
anybody.
And you collected some of these writings while you were at seminary, which is like fancy pastor theology
This
training
is
school, right?
true. Yes, I graduated from seminary in 2014. So my degree is in Old Testament or Hebrew Bible studies. And I went the academic road. So you went the ministry road. I went the academic road. And then I still kind of ended up in ministry anyways. So go figure.
It happens. It's kind of a swapsy
Mhm.
kind of life.
Yep.
But I love that you centered a lot of your work and your writing in the Old Testament or the Hebrew
Mhm.
Bible because a lot of folk who have heard maybe negative things about trans folk in the Bible have heard about it primarily from the Hebrew Bible. And it kind of centers around something called the Imago Dei, or the image of God. Would you be
Mm.
willing to speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason that I went into studying the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible anyway is because I had experienced those sort of clobber verses as, a queer and trans person. And so that was why I was so interested in it, was like, what actually is here? How can we understand this better? Or maybe in a different way, maybe not better. But yeah, so one of the sort of main understandings or ideas in the first five books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, is this idea of the Imago Dei, or the image of God, and what the image of God is. And so a lot of times people get hung up on the first two chapters of Genesis, where it talks about God creating people. And then people look at that and they're like, oh, it says God created people male and female. So like, there you go, that's what we got. And so that then makes people feel like, non-binary folks shouldn't exist or don't exist, right? And then it also gives you this sense of like, you get your gender from God, and you like can't bring it back with a receipt, not allowed. But so people kind of get hung up on that. And throughout Christian history, there have been some people that have connected gender or assigned sex with the idea of the Imago Dei, or image of God, and have kind of said like, this is part of like, your gender is super important, or your assigned sex is super important because it's part of like God in you. But then there have also been lots of people in Christian history and Jewish history as well, of course, because we share this scripture with our Jewish siblings, that look at that and they go, wait, that doesn't make any sense, because God doesn't have an assigned sex or gender. Like, that God is beyond gender, beyond assigned sex. So like, that can't possibly be what the image of God is. So we've done a lot of thinking throughout history about like, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And lots of people have lots of different answers to that. But I think one of the most important things that we can take away from being made in the image of God in Genesis is that God is a creator being. God creates stuff. And that's like all we know about God in Genesis 1 is God is creating, earth and sea and sun and moon and like all these things. And so when people are made in God's image, they are also made as creators. We also create stuff. And there are some theologians that talk about us being co-creators with God, that God sort of starts a thing and then gives it to us as humans, and then humans kind of run with that and make something else. Like, you know, humans, God gives us, ways of figuring out science, and then we create vaccines that help people, right? Like we do all kinds of things that we work in as co-creators with God. So when we think about trans folks in the image of God, one of the ways that I love to think about it is the idea that trans folks are co-creators with God in the sort of changing of our bodies or identities or whatever ways that make us most ourselves, we are coming into our image of God in that moment by being co-creators with God. So yeah, I've always really liked that sort of understanding of the text.
Yeah, and some of the then kind of conversation that people have is like, well, but if you take a next step that changes things, have you screwed it all up or not?
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of that biblical conversation kind of heads towards Deuteronomy or to conversations about folk who were called eunuchs, which traditionally were people who either through their own choice or without their consent had parts of their procreative system crushed or transformed or mutilated in some sort of way to make it less functional. Sometimes that was because people wanted to entirely focus on studies. Sometimes it was because people wanted to have communal groups that were these kind of creative gender expressions. Sometimes it was because it was just an elevated form of society. Like the Ethiopian eunuch was the equivalent of the economy secretary of all of Ethiopia, right? So it was this kind of prestigious way of getting to be in royal court. But there's all these texts that people have used, some that talk about, well, in one portion of the Bible that talk about, well, maybe people who have crushed body parts shouldn't be allowed in sacred places in the temple. And you write kind of beautifully about your discovering other parts of the book of Deuteronomy that and Isaiah that kind of changed the way you thought about these kind of restrictive texts. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a verse, Deuteronomy 23:1 is the verse that says that nobody who has been sort of, the language they use is like castrated, right? So usually they're talking about people who were assigned male at birth. But that's not the entirety of what we know eunuchs to be, but that's what it's talking about specifically in that verse. And basically there's so many other verses in that particular part of the Bible about like what is and isn't allowed, that later on the rules are sort of tweaked or changed slightly. And so we've got this verse in Deuteronomy 23:1 that says no eunuchs, people who are castrated, are allowed within the community of Israel. And we're not totally sure what that means, right? That could have meant like they weren't supposed to be allowed in community. It could have meant they weren't, one tradition says that it meant that if you were a person assigned male at birth who was castrated, you weren't allowed to marry an Israelite woman because you couldn't have kids. So like there's a lot of thought about what this is, but a lot of scholars think that what it meant was eunuchs are now not allowed to worship in the temple alongside everybody else, or not in specific parts of the temple. And so we see kind of like throughout time after Deuteronomy is written, we see what happens is the Israelites are captured by the Babylonians and then held captive by the Persians. And in those societies, in Babylon and in Persia, castration or the creation of eunuchs was super common. It was just part of society in a way that it wasn't in Israelite society. And so what ends up happening is that many Israelites either choose castration or experience it, become eunuchs in some way or another. And so when the people of Israel try to reform back in, when they get released from captivity, when they try to reform their whole society, they have this problem where they're like, wait a minute, we look back at our formative scriptures and we see that it says eunuchs aren't allowed, but now we have eunuchs in our community. So like, do we kick them out? Like, what are we supposed to do? And it's in that point when we hear the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 56. God speaks through Isaiah and said, eunuchs and foreigners, these two groups that were not supposed to be led into the temple, were not supposed to be part of the community, they are now going to have a special blessing from God and a special welcome into community. And so even, I think a lot of times people think of like the Old Testament as like angry, exclusive God, and the New Testament as like loving, inclusive God. And that's not true. Like even within the Old Testament, we have this movement from exclusion to inclusion, even within these older texts. And so we see this movement where it's like, okay, these people that maybe we didn't understand or didn't think very well of, God now is enfolding them in a welcome that nobody really expected.
Yeah, I love the similar kind of rhythm. The language is a little bit kind of more poetic and dwells in me a bit deeper from Hosea, this idea that in the place where it was declared to you that you are not my people, it will be declared, you are my people, right?
Uh-huh.
And so this is a God who errs on the side of honoring covenants and of calling us to love and calling us to be people who are hospitable to each other, right?
Uh-huh.
The disciples in Jesus's time aren't told go find the most prestigious person who follows the tenets the best. It's like go stay with whoever is hospitable first,
Uh-huh.
and then don't upgrade. Like
Uh-huh.
stay with those folk as
Uh-huh.
long as you need to be in that area. And so I just think there's something really beautiful about this idea that if God can expand their idea of
Uh-huh.
who is beloved, then
Uh-huh.
certainly at some point, if we in fact are a part of that image of God, that we too can maybe expand our idea of who is beloved.
Agreed.
Towards the end of your book, you talk about this vision that you have that we will be able to kind of at some point depart from like defensive Bible reading, if that's a way to put it, and moving into like a theology beyond politics or
Uh-huh.
beyond apologizing.
Uh-huh.
Could you describe a little bit like what you envision that looking like?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that can happen within like trans theology or theology done by trans folks, and this honestly is true in like larger LGBTQ plus
Mm-hmm.
Christian spaces as well, is we get stuck just going over and over these same 5 to 7 passages, and we just keep
Yeah.
going over them and over them,
Yep.
trying to explain to people. And what that ends up doing is, one, it creates a defensiveness in us that we feel like we have to constantly be like protecting ourselves, defending ourselves, and we don't get to let ourselves grow, right?
Mm-hmm.
It creates this sense that we're always under attack. And honestly, that is a true experience for many people, the sense that you're always under attack because of your identity. So I don't want to invalidate that. But I think we can accidentally compound that when we just keep doing defense work all the time. And so one of the things that I like to think about when we think about moving beyond the apologies and beyond the defensiveness is seeing all of the places in scripture where our experiences as trans folks connect to the experiences of people in scripture, even though it's not about necessarily about gender at all, right? I'm a big fan of Joy Layden, who's a Jewish trans woman who writes a lot, and she just wrote a really great book called The Soul of the Stranger. And I believe that's the name of the book. I think that's it, Welcoming the Soul of the Stranger. But she's amazing, and she writes about her connection with Abraham and how she sees Abraham as like having all these very trans sort of experiences, even though it's not really about gender. It's about Abraham leaving other kinds of identities. But so like going beyond apologetics or beyond defensiveness allows us to connect with all of scripture rather than just like 7 points, which is, I think, something that we need as individuals for our own like health and flourishing. But I think it's also something that if we don't get to do that, the church also misses out on that as well, because we can see things that other people can't, and other people with other identities see things that we can't. And so we need each other to be able to read it all like wholly.
100%. And I've been laughing to myself in my house because every once in a while when I'm thinking about like trans sacredness, the like Bible camp song, Rock of My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham, comes into my head because I'm like, it's been there all along. Rock of My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham? Like Abraham has a bosom? You know what I mean? Like there are all of these references. Like I think Rabbi Mark Samus says there's like 22 different references of fathers nursing children, like breastfeeding children, right? And God, El Shaddai, literally meaning God the many-breasted, like, right? And so there's all these really beautiful transgender moments that are happening throughout scripture, and we just have stopped reading them that way because contemporary folk, I guess, get the heebie-jeebies by them. I don't know, but
Well,
but they're there and they're fun.
They are, and I think it comes like, if you can imagine throughout like human history, throughout the like history of the Bible, maybe if God is constantly giving people all these different metaphoric understandings of who God is and what God is like, but it's being written down mainly by people of one specific gender, they're going to hold on to the metaphors that make sense to their experience, and they might not write down the ones that don't make sense with their experience. So like, it's really cool to see the places where it has been written down, like more feminine metaphors for God are written down by maybe more masculine identified writers, because they're holding on to something that maybe doesn't make entire sense to them, but they're putting it down, and then later on we can sort of resonate with that in a different way. Yeah, I don't know. I get excited thinking about like God giving us like a whole banquet of metaphors, and then we get to go like, oh, this makes sense to me, and then maybe somebody else says, well, I like this one better, and you're like, well, cool, it's all here.
Yeah, and I don't know. Have you seen Rabbi Samit's book yet? The
I
Name?
haven't. I've heard about it, but I haven't seen it.
Like Yahweh backwards in Hebrew means he, she. Like because they read when the rabbis read the words in the scripture, they're taught to read them backwards and forwards and diagonal, because there's all of these like beautiful puns in them, and like it's just mind exploding. You're just like, what, Rabbi? It makes me wish I was much better at Hebrew than
Fair.
I took the
Hebrew is a
time to be.
fascinating language, and one that I think we don't like appreciate enough in Christian circles.
Yeah, like I just love this idea that there are so many different like gifts in scripture that it could take so many different lifetimes to just like peer at different parts of it. That's always, and I also love, I'm kind of you can tell I'm a pastor, because I love that sacred scripture not only is something beloved by me, but the person who will spend their entire life trying to do the opposite work that I am too. I'm like, God's up to something. It's awesome. Well, so one thing that I do know is that particularly doing the work of tackling clobbering texts, right? It can be tough stuff, and the world has gotten tougher recently. And I wonder if there are ways that you take care of yourself in times like these that you'd be willing to share publicly on the internet.
Yeah, I was gonna go with something a little bit more general, but something that I've found myself doing a lot lately is recognizing all the ways that that I hold and carry the stories and experiences of the people in my community. And I think we all do that to different extents, where we kind of, even if it's just sitting with a friend and listening to them talk about what's going on in their lives, we hold that a little bit, I think. And lately I've been trying to find ways to sort of at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, at some point in the day, to kind of count all those little things that I'm holding, and then to give them to God and say, like, I can't hold these all the time. Like we want to hold things for each other. That's part of what being a community is. But it's not the kind of thing where you can, I mean, you're not God, right? You can't hold this stuff all the time, and it's heavy. And to be able to kind of count them, and I kind of think of them as marbles. I kind of think of them as like I'm holding these like collection of marbles, and I kind of have to go, okay, I got to give somebody else these marbles for a while. And God is the one who can handle all of them. And so trying to find ways to do that, I think opens you up then to be able to hold more marbles at some point, and to be able to share yours with somebody else. And so that's a practice that I've been kind of working on. It's like, how can I let go so that I'm not just like completely crushed by all the things that I'm holding?
Yeah, I really resonate with that, because part of what I do in my life, I think, is maybe not consciously doing that. I like the idea of doing it much more consciously, of thinking about the ways that you're like holding on to stuff that maybe isn't yours to carry in the future. But I gravitate towards like tangible projects that have clear completions, but specifically ones that like allow me to kind of like think about something maybe that's weighing me down or problematic, but it like recycles into something else. So I've been like melting candles from rich churches that they didn't use very much because they just bought new ones. and I transform them into like new candles, or like James Baldwin candles from their Christ candle snubs. And so there's just something really beautiful about having a way to like change that. For me, it's often been the ritual of burning things for Ash Wednesday, which is, it's traditionally palm leaves, but we're eco-conscious now, and it like slaughters so many different palm trees to like get all of those palms. And so what we've been doing is when we gather and protest or post up prayers at vigils, at a couple days later, when they're starting to get tattered and torn from flapping in the wind and being outside, I'll collect them and we'll burn them and kind of transform the tears and the pain and the passion for like changing the world into this like, you know, ashy glitter ash. We put a little bit of sea-safe glitter in it to remember that it's not all terrible, but just that ability to transform things. Right now, if you're stuck sheltering in place, experimenting with fire and burning things might not be helpful.
Idea.
Yeah, do it outside if you can. Fire extinguisher and all of that business. But yeah, I think tangible ways that people can not get clogged.
Yeah, and sometimes it's like, you know, I was using the example of marbles, but like if you go outside and you pick up a couple rocks, like you can kind of like hold it in your hand for a while. Like my therapist taught me this one. He was like, hold something in your hand for a while and like clench it as tight as you can. And then when you let go of it, you have this feeling of like, whoa, like it's gone. And it gives you this feeling of like, it tells your body like it's okay to let something go. So even having like a physical representation of that, I think can be really helpful for your body to remember like, okay, I'm really doing this. It's not just in my head, you know?
Yeah. And it's such a great thing to know that like, you know, you can narrow the folk outside of you whose stuff you're carrying during a time that it's harder.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe in a time when it's not as hard, you can take on more, but that we can like change and expand and just, you know, do what's ours at this given time rather than needing to be superheroes all the time, which I think is a common trans way of adapting in a world that's tough on us, right?
That's true.
Will you tell us a little bit more about the ministry collective?
Yeah, so Transmission Ministry Collective, we just started it a couple months ago, but it's been something that's been in the works for a long time. Basically, our goal is to create support and spiritual care and faith formation opportunities for trans and gender expansive folks and people of trans experience. So basically, we have support groups that go twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it's really fun. We have like a question of the day that we talk about, and then we just check in and say hi. We have every other week on Mondays, we have a Bible study online that anybody can join, and I'm the only one on camera, and then everybody else talks via chat. And then we've got a Discord server, which is like a text chat server. And so we've got that as well. And then we have monthly workshops and all kinds of stuff. So this month's workshop actually is coming up, I believe, next week. I have to look at my calendar. Hold on, because it's going to be interesting. Yes, so next Wednesday is going to be one led by an awesome couple of mental health professionals who are going to be talking about dealing with spiritual trauma. So if you've had any kind of like spiritual trauma in the past and you're thinking about like deconstruction and reconstruction, I'm very excited about that one. That was a big request from our community. So yeah, we do all that kind of stuff, and you can find us at transmissionministry.com.
I'm going to put that link down here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm grateful that you spent some time with us. How can people connect with you if they want to learn more or you know, chat? Hand you a couple of their marbles.
Right. Exactly. I think probably, well, you can find me at austenhartke.com. So that's one. That's probably the main place to find everything. But I'm on Twitter and Instagram as Austen Lionheart. That was my old handle that I just never changed. So you can find me there. And then on Facebook, I'm Austen Hartke as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time and for everything you're doing.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.